We explicitly named it the Solidarity Caravan because the main premise of our entire trip was to really focus on building solidarity with different movements around the world. We don't just live in a national world. We don't live in a world of nations anymore, but we live in a global world. We live in a globalized world where, people around the world have Twitter and Instagram and we have fast food workers everywhere. We have low-wage workers everywhere. And struggles aren't just national anymore, they're international. And the whole purpose of our caravan was really to bring attention to this situation, this crisis that was part of one of the many crises that we experienced in the capitalism. And this crisis, was specifically targeting the migrant community, especially people who were fleeing from Latin American countries, more specifically Central America and Mexico. So just to start, one of the things that I thought was very interesting about the child migrant crisis, some of you guys may have heard about it earlier this year. There were a lot of photos that were leaked online of children who were found in cages and in very horrible conditions in immigration centers along the southwest border with the United States and Mexico. And the media really treated it as a huge surprise. They were completely surprised that, there were hundreds of kids at the border lined up who were detained and families being split up. And we were pretty much fighting against that very conception of treating it as a very isolated thing, whereas the child migrant crisis, as we know, has been going on for many decades, and especially with Central America in terms of the U.S. funding for imperialist forces in Latin America. So during the 60s and 70s, you had the very grunt of the Monroe Doctrine that was funding dictatorships in Guatemala and in El Salvador, right-wing fascist dictatorships that, created an exodus of children who were fleeing Central American countries because they were joining the guerrillas and the anti-imperialist movements. In El Salvador, you had the FMLN, and anyone who's associated with the FMLN was, you were shot instantly if you were looking to make it alive and fled. And basically, a lot of that is going on now with two countries in particular, with Mexico and Honduras. There has been a decrease in the number of migrant children that are coming from El Salvador. And why is that? Because there's a socialist government in power, there's a workers' party in power, and there's FMLN. And, that's something that's really important in talking about the child migrant crisis is, why are there more children coming from the capitalist countries of Mexico and Honduras? And it's, largely because these countries are unable to resolve the very contradictions that capitalism has in its very nature. And it isn't able to resolve mass poverty, mass inequality, so forth. There weren't many children, there wasn't a mass exodus of people from Nicaragua, right? Because, as you know, there are social programs put in place to prevent that kind of these situations from happening. Same thing with El Salvador. A majority of the people who were coming from Central America were coming from the capitalist countries of Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico as a result of the free trade agreements that were put in place by the U.S. and multinational corporations. So that's one thing I wanted to mention is, in analyzing with the Solidarity Caravan and with, just going city by city and speaking with people and immigrants who are being affected, it wasn't, these weren't families from Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua or Bolivia. These weren't families in the anti-imperialist countries and the socialist, the worker states. These are people from capitalist countries that were, that are coming here, and some of the most oppressed sectors in Honduras. With the Solidarity Caravan, we had two comrades who were of the Garitana peoples. They were indigenous and African descendant Hondurans, and those are some of the most oppressed people as well in that country. So they spoke a lot about the kind of the systemic racism that was going on, and the way that there was a lot of racism, very overt racism against Afro-Latino immigrants that are coming over the border as well. Our caravan was basically dedicated to, building solidarity and building, connecting these different struggles together as one struggle, because unfortunately, and, this, I don't want to use this as a harsh criticism of a lot of the movements here, but a lot of struggles have been very disconnected from each other. The immigrant struggle, the prison industrial complex struggle, women's struggle, LGBTQ rights, and so forth. They've all been fragmented as part of this, and that fragmentation is, I would say also a reflection of the kind of neoliberal, individualistic society, Darwinistic society that we live in today, where you're given the title of you're given a specialty. I'm an immigrant activist, or I'm a LGBT activist. But this caravan, we were fighting in a response to an immigrant issue, but we were also bringing attention to other issues that were connected with it as well, because it's also very interconnected with other issues around the world. And I think that's what really helped me, and Caleb will talk about this more later on, is really having that mesh of theory and practice, right, of dialectics, of being able to see how different units under capitalism are all more related than we think, and that methodology is so important in our revolutionary work, of being able to speak, immigrant activists being able to speak with prison industrial complex activists and LGBTQ and so forth. So this trip really helped me learn more about that. But one thing that I will say about this caravan is, every issue is important, and there were so many issues that are interconnected with the migrant struggle. It is a working people struggle because these immigrants are part of the working class, right? It's not the richest 1% of these Latin American countries that are being held at the border and detained and, being sent to detention camps. It's not the 1%, it's the 99% of these Latin American countries that are being detained. And I mentioned it in an earlier talk as well, but there are no borders to the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie does not have any borders. It's really the working class from a lot of these countries that are coming in that have these borders put in place that are, very racist and very classist. And so that was one of the main messages of our trip, is really forging the migrant struggle with the worker struggle, because the struggle of the immigrant is also the struggle of the working class people, because these are oftentimes families that are looking to move to the United States to earn more capital, to send it back to their families, in places where free trade agreements have been put in place by the U.S. government, where the prices of commodities have risen. Privatization has completely destroyed a lot of the lifestyles that people have enjoyed, and you'll have certain countries where the prices of goods are so high that their families are forced to migrate to this country. So this caravan, we wanted to make clear that it wasn't also just about getting more rights for immigrants and making, creating better conditions here in the U.S., but completely eradicating the conditions that made the migrants to begin with, So really addressing those issues, really addressing the neoliberal economic policies of the U.S. in Latin American countries that created the forced migration, and putting in an address to this issue, because the anti-imperialist struggle is so important to the immigrant struggle today, because they're not linked, unfortunately, and they haven't been linked as well as they should be. But anti-imperialism is so important because imperialism is happening now as we speak. Imperialism isn't just about sending troops and tanks into a country. And, we think of imperialism and we think of 17th century English imperialism with, with the Navy and troops. And, the imperialism of today is very much equivalent to an NGO, going to a Latin American country and quantifying everything and, seeing how much money they can make and privatize and, embellishing it as development, and having the nerve, the audacity to call that development, and to open up a McDonald's and a Burger King and call them a developed modern country. So that's the imperialism of today, right? There's a phenomenology involved with imperialism. It transforms, the essence is the same, right? Imperialism is about bringing this racist, classist identity to oppressed peoples and saying this is how you should live, and this is how you need to be, and this is what it means to be a modern society and a stable society. And that a lot of times gets hidden in our in today because imperialism has changed its form but not its essence, right? Its form today are NGOs or neoliberal institutions that are going into these countries and seeming like these progressive leaders that are so hopeful for change, and they make it seem like a race, right? They make it seem like these Latin American countries are and African countries and all around the world, like they're behind in this race and they need to catch up. And that's really what's causing a lot of the problems with immigration, because these countries with governments that have people who are pro-West and in favor of the Washington Consensus and privatization and selling out their country's resources, they embark on things like the war on drugs, right? In Mexico right now, you have the 43 students who went missing because they were protesting Mexico's war on drugs and their privatization and so many different things. And, these students went missing, and, unfortunately, it seems very much like they were pretty much slaughtered by the Mexican government. And that's an immigration issue, because they were protesting the very conditions that create immigration, right? And that just gives you a sense of how tied these struggles are together, because it is because of imperialism that immigration exists to begin with. Immigration creates imperialism creates immigration from a lot of these countries, and like I said before, why aren't people, this is one thing the U.S. loved to brag about, during the early 90s and the special period in Cuba. They're like, oh, we have so many Cubans coming to the U.S., but not anymore. The people coming to the U.S. now are people who are coming from capitalist countries that have been working with U.S. imperialism. They're coming from Honduras, Colombia, Mexico. You don't see people coming in from Nicaragua or Bolivia or worker states. And that's why, in addressing immigration, we also have to raise anti-imperialism, and we can't be afraid to defend worker states that are creating more favorable conditions for the working class today, because these countries aren't producing a mass exodus of people leaving their countries because they have social programs in place. So, that's something that we really wanted to talk about in our caravan, is really not just fighting for immigrant rights, but fighting for anti-imperialism and fighting to defend worker states that already have social programs in place to prevent a massive exodus of people leaving these countries. On our caravan, we had people representing very diverse backgrounds. We had indigenous peoples from here in North America. We had African American, we had white, black, Latino, and we had very diverse sectors of society that represented, the most oppressed and marginalized peoples around the world. We were fortunate enough to actually visit Jackson, Mississippi, where Chokwe Lumumba, who is a great leader of the working class in Mississippi, his son, gave a talk on the importance of uniting the anti-racist struggle with the immigrant struggle, linking Ferguson with the border, because this summer you had two major issues, right? You had, among the many other issues that are going on here, but, two major issues. You had the racist police brutality in Ferguson, and you had the racist militarization of the borders. And both of these struggles were linked, both of these struggles were intertwined, because the same prisons that protesters are being thrown into in Ferguson, Missouri, are the same institutions that are owned by the same people who have private contracts with the U.S. government to keep migrants, locked up, and that's why, we had people who were representing so many different aspects of that struggle of uniting, black and brown oppression, and of uniting like these struggles together, because the jails, the military industrial complexes that have prisoners from Ferguson protesting are the same ones who own the facilities where the migrants are being held, and it's hard for us to make that connection, because we see companies and corporations as not part of the government, right? We don't see the corporations as an extension of the state, but if they're directly contracted by the state, then they are the state, and that's why, the way we define the state has to really evolve with the way the state is changing and creating new forms of oppression, right? Because the state moves and it contracts and expands, and we need to be able to read that. So with this caravan, we wanted to, form part of our analysis. We're saying no to U.S. imperialism and U.S. militarization, but we're also saying no to the bourgeois, neoliberal institutions and NGOs that are coming into Latin America and trying to tell us, what it means to be a developed country or to be an advanced country. So that was very important for our struggle. We also wanted to show a lot of solidarity with Palestine because the conditions on the border of Texas and Mexico and all along the border in general are very similar to West Bank and Gaza because, there are checkpoints that are made about 200 miles out of the border with Mexico. So basically, we had two comrades with us who were undocumented and were unable to join us south of San Antonio. We drove from New York to South Texas, and they were unable to join us from San Antonio down to Mexico because they were undocumented, and if they did pass that threshold, then they would be detained by immigration. So there is kind of like this geographic area along the border where there are conditions that really resemble Gaza, where you have checkpoints established, very similar to Israel. You have checkpoints where, you have to show your identification and you have to prove that you're going to work somewhere and whatnot. And if you don't belong there, then you're detained. So the situation in Texas and the border is very similar to occupied Palestine. You have a lot of areas that are completely colonized. And let's remember, Texas is part of, Mexico is part of the colonized areas and part of the areas that were completely pillaged by the European racist settlers, and called the Republic of Texas. And those areas don't belong to them. So it really is, imperialism is domestic and foreign. That's why I kind of wanted to touch more on that angle for today. Is, as revolutionaries, we shouldn't be afraid to call ourselves anti-imperialists, right? Because imperialism isn't just abroad, it's also domestic. Imperialism is, the U.S. sending militarized police to Ferguson, to their own communities where people have been living for generations, and telling them that they're wrong to rebel because they're fighting against conditions that are oppressing them, and going to their own lands and trying to tell them how to pacify them and to keep them obedient. And the same thing is going on in Texas with the border, where you have immigration and, these racist, these fascists, who are going to the border and telling people, you have to follow the rules and this and that, when the very lands that they're standing on don't belong to them, right? Because 1868, Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you had the U.S. giving a few crumbs to the Mexican government and claiming that the whole Southwest belongs to the U.S. now, Western expansion, and so forth. So we all know that these grounds, these contracts, right, these social contracts of obedience and obligation to the state are completely, irrational, and they create these contracts and these ideas of, pacifying us in order to stop us from fighting against real oppression. So that was a big component of our caravan, is we wanted to link the anti-imperialist struggle with immigrant struggle, and not just call out the U.S. government for its oppressive fascist policies in the border, but we also wanted to applaud those worker states that are creating conditions so that people don't have to leave their countries, right? You have countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, that have social programs where students can study at any university in the world and come back, and as long as they work for a few years and help out that country, then they can go to that university for free. And you don't see that happening in capitalist Latin American countries that are completely the lapdogs of Western imperialism. And so we wanted to have that message of anti-imperialism, but also applaud those worker states that have really done a great job at eradicating the conditions that even lead to migration. Because again, migrants aren't coming from the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. They're not coming from Cuba. They're not coming from, Sandinista, Nicaragua, like from Bolivia. They're coming from Colombia, Mexico, Honduras. These are capitalist, right-wing governed countries, These aren't socialist countries. These aren't worker states. And that was a big part of our caravan. There's also there are so many components to it. There's an LGBTQ component to it as well, because migrants who are LGBTQ don't have the same rights as those who aren't. If you're, a gay couple and, you recognize your own marriage and the state won't recognize them, unfortunately, and they won't allow, gay or lesbian couples to stay together. A lot of times you get split up. And there are a lot of issues like that. It's also, a lot of women are directly targeted because a lot of women are the ones who are bringing their children. What we've seen when speaking with people at the border are that there's a pattern where the male, the father will travel and migrate to North America and to the U.S. to find jobs, and then the family will then migrate a few months later, if not a few years later, to eventually meet with the father and establish their family here in the U.S. But a lot of these, the women and their children are being split up. The children are being sent to detention centers and to immigration facilities, and the women are being directly targeted. Those who aren't deported back to their countries where they will most likely be killed because of the violence. The ones who do get to stay in the U.S. temporarily are, basically adorned with shackles that have GPS tracking devices on them. As we speak, there are women in the Bronx right now who are black women, black Honduran women, hundreds of them who have shackles on their legs and basically monitoring every movement that they make, and they have to call immigration like every few hours to catch up. That's happening as we speak right now, Their families split up. They have no idea where they are. In Texas, we also witness mass graveyards. And these are the graveyards where different people are kept when they aren't identified, if they don't have identification on them. So a lot of times there are people who, migrate to the U.S. and will get shot by immigration on the border, and they'll never get, their families back home will have no idea that they actually were killed, and they think that their relatives just moved to the U.S. and completely forgot about them. So that's another issue that's going on as well. There were a lot of very gruesome things that we saw on the border. There are a lot of areas within that 200-mile radius. I like to call it, Texas's own Gaza. There is a Gaza in Texas. There is a Gaza in the Southwest. That area where, migrants are kind of stuck, right, between the checkpoint and the border. Because if they go farther south, they're going to be detained. If they go north by the checkpoint, then they'll be deported back to their home country. So they're kind of stuck in this 200-mile area where, those also happen to be the areas where their hospitals are being shut down, where there is no work, and this is Texas, where a lot of social programs are being cut. So it is a working class issue. It is a workers' issue, and that's why the workers' movement has to stand in solidarity with the immigration struggle, because these are the people who are at the grunt of U.S. imperialism and capitalism and oppression, and they are experiencing it firsthand in very gross and horrific ways, especially with the Garifuna people of Honduras, who are indigenous and Afro-descendant. Their whole culture is being destroyed because a lot of the children are being separated from their families, and the children are sent to basically foster homes, American foster homes, and they're not raised within their indigenous and Afro-descendant culture, and they lose a lot of that, which is very important to that community because historically they've been pillaged throughout many centuries. So there are many forms of institutionalized genocide and racism that we may not be aware of. But one thing that this caravan has really showed all of us that were on it was that there are people even within our own borders here in the U.S. that are experiencing conditions just as hard as someone in Gaza or in anywhere else that's a victim of U.S. imperialism, and it's happening right within our own the so-called country, the so-called United States of America. There are people who are the faceless, one thing that I really enjoyed is that a lot of the activists in Texas who come from directly after the Chicano movement, with the Chicano rights movement in the Southwest, where that a lot of them would wear Zapatista masks, and the Zapatistas were, these revolutionaries in Mexico who fought against the capitalist Mexican state, and they would wear a lot of masks that do not show their face, and they call themselves the faceless, and that's a symbol of the way that the U.S. and Mexican governments treat immigrants. They treat them as if they weren't people, as if they have no faces, as if they have no families. And as we can see, they put them in mass burial graves and in situations where they have no identity and they have no regard for who they are. So basically, there is a very big revolutionary culture in the Southwest. Although there are a lot of misconceptions about the South being very conservative and ultra-conservative, I would say that is limited to the government and the sellouts in power who have, ceded that power to the state. But there are a lot of progressive, revolutionary, socialist forces in the Southwest who are really fighting for workers, immigrants' rights right now. And overall, as I mentioned, it's so important that we, as immigrant rights activists and as workers activists, we're able to, we have to be able to point to certain places and say, look, like that's kind of what we're going for. You can't, we can't fight for something and not have an example of what we should, what we should have. And, Cuba is a great example of that. They have, Cuba has so many programs to prevent mass immigration and so many programs to prevent. There is no police brutality. There's no institutionalized police brutality in Cuba. There is no institutionalized repression of the working class in Cuba. And we need to not only fight against those who are doing the oppression, who are imposing oppression on us, but we also have to show solidarity to states that are fighting against that very same oppression in the international battlefield, right? So that was a very important component of our caravan. And overall, I just want to, before I finish, just want to really emphasize the importance of uniting the struggles everywhere, and not becoming a specialist in one particular struggle or one trend in a movement. There's so many aspects of capitalism that are horrible. You can talk about the environment, you can talk about the prison industrial complex, racism, classism, misogyny, and so many components. But until we're able to really unite all of those together and, show up to each other's demos and help each other spread awareness about and also fight against that oppression, we're not going to be able to do anything, because our movement will remain fragmented and very atomized and isolated if we only stick with our particular fields of activism. So I just want to, want everyone to walk away with, if you hear about an immigrant rights protest, although it may not necessarily eschew like words of socialism or workers' rights or, anti-imperialism, the space is created there for anyone to kind of go in and lead it in that direction, which is very much seems like it is, because right now people are fighting for immigration rights, but in Mexico people are also fighting for socialism and the fight against the government and the fight against the imperialist policies of the Mexican government and the U.S. government. So, if you hear about an immigration rights protest, join it one day and, pitch your angle, see how it is, and, really unite the struggles. They're not mutually exclusive. They're all connected. And I just wanted to mention that. So thank you. Thank you.